For the library of the Duke's archives of all material pertinent to the Convergence, hail in Orlando, in the first flame we trust. This is transcript officer number 16, record 736F75-6C, commencing log. Now. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. My dearest stray, it should come as no surprise to you that the lands between are a thanatocracy. They hold their breath as they wish for death. Returning to the Erd Tree is the greatest honor of all. But at this point in our exploration, the Erd Tree is naught but a distant dream whose dreamer is yet to awaken. Long ago, the civilization that built the eternal cities worshipped a pre-grace form of the greater will, and were associated with ghost flame, which was, in turn, associated with death birds instead of the golden boughs of the Erd Tree. The ancestral spirit cycle of rebirth indicates both fauna and flora were excluded from the Greater Will's pool of resources, though they were still given proper reverence. There are depictions of roots supporting their patriarchs and a caste of night folk, the ancestral followers tending to these spirits in their eternal shrines. But they who are not immortal cannot hope to conjure that which is eternal. Such is the hubris of men. Soon all would change. Their precious life and their treasured death. Nothing would ever be the same again. March of the Black Queen. My good friend, have I told you of a lass that goes by the name of Melina? Upon reaching these lands after a science greeting in a flurry of violence, kind Melina found me half dead and extended me succor. She's a bit of a doll, if I may say so myself. Not quite as welcoming and not quite as unnerving either. But just like our plain old companion, she hides all manner of secrets behind her glassy eye. You could hardly tell by her demeanor, but I believe she was once a figure of great import, though I also believe she may not have known that herself. Not at first, at any rate. She presents herself as a daughter to Queen Marika the Eternal. She doesn't state such words just as plainly, but the meaning is there to anyone who cares to listen. But I cannot help but to think a more unreliable narrator there never was. She clearly holds no full recollection of her own memories, can't even recall the purpose she was given by her supposed mother. And at one point she spoke to me of Bach, our humble colleague, saying, "I see him crying from time to time. I think he misses his mother. He wants someone to tell him he's beautiful. Does being born of a mother mean one behaves in such a manner?" If Melina has no knowledge of what it means to be born of a mother, then could she really know who her mother was? Once, yes, of course. But in this sorry state of subservience, the poor thing seems to know only that which she was told. But to those of us who are privy to unseen cycles beyond life and death, who have seen the Elden Ring broken and mended more times than they care to remember, Melina's true self is evident. Having seen her crowned with a full head of black hair, having seen her dusked eyes companion opened, I have known her to be the gloam-eyed queen, harbinger of vengeance, from whom the rune of death by Malekith was stolen. And I should note that previously there were mentions of both dusk and gloam-eyed queens in the translated records, but that seems to have been changed to only gloam on account of both instances having been referenced with the same kanji in their Land of Reed's counterparts. Now, having been a queen, her defeat at the hands of Marika escalates in meaning and makes such victory a coup. The conclusion is that there was a kingdom and an age serving as an interlude between the rule of the eternal cities and the epic of the Erd Tree, the classical era of the Sun Realm, ruled by destined death and the gloam-eyed queen. And I find myself amused by the thought that Ranni and Miquella's attempted takeovers might be tradition more than a revolution. Empyreans, the lot of them. You can't promise someone their owed greatness and expect them not to seek after it sooner or later, I suppose. When contemplated side by side, both their rules aren't entirely dissimilar. Both queens conjoined Elden Lords, Godfrey, Radagon, and Placidus Axe. As Empyreans appointed by the Fingers, both served the greater will. And just like Marika, Melina must have served as a vessel to the Elden Ring as well. The many rings engraving in Farum Azula implies as much, and the rune of death itself, which is analogous to Marika's seal but presented upside down and is clearly visible in all representations of the Elden Ring, should be enough to confirm it. This revelation provides us with some much-needed context for our exploration going forward. Removing Destined Death from the Elden Ring was the act of replacing the influence of Melena's outer god with Marika's rune and the Rule of Grace. And thus the Golden Order was born. The Rune of Death goes by two names. The other is Destined Death, the forbidden shadow plucked from the Golden Order upon its creation. The seat of the sun in the age of the Crucible. From what I could ascertain, Melina ruled over what was known as the Time of the Sun Realm, and Farum Azula was its capital. Luckily, much physical evidence remains to be observed, static derelicts of a once great kingdom. Thus, the greatest challenge in our scholarly endeavor lies in overcoming the attrition between history and time. Pockets of information can still be found here and there, but not much to connect them. A gentle reminder that although history is never truly lost, it can still be easily forgotten, especially when it's willfully so. First, even though it's been stipulated by some that the lands between have no sun and that Farum Azula may exist outside the flow of time, I must say both assumptions are demonstrably incorrect. The sun may be overpowered by the light of the Erdtree for most of the day, but it can still be seen occasionally, particularly at the horizon, at dawn. And though Placidusax does in fact reside outside the flow of time, the rest of the city does not. Something that is confirmed by the fact that the burning Erdtree can be seen from Farum Azula as well. Then, regarding Farum Azula's status as merely a capital rather than a kingdom unto itself, it bears remembering the records of the Old Lord's talisman, calling it a royal city. And it should also be noted such city seems to be associated with the entirety of the continent, not just its crumbling little neighborhood. Caelid is home to the Bestial Sanctum and the Farum Great Bridge. Limgrave's Stormveil can be linked to Farum Azula through their shared storm motif, the Banished Knight's dragon adornments, and even the presence of a distinctively named Beastman of Farum Azula inside the Groveside Cave. And of course, the ruins of a Farum-like structure, which is said to once have floated in the skies, are scattered all across these lands. When it comes to the Sun Realm, the only records mentioning this kingdom by name seem to come from the shields carried by those who live in death. These ashen creatures don't seem too out of place at first. What's another cursed, undying bastard among the likes of undead nobles and the tarnished? But their attire, unlike any I've seen worn by my contemporary warriors, along with their aforementioned shields, clearly place them as out of time. Remnants of an age long gone, slowly making their way across the lands between, like that crumbling city whose dying wails soar upon a gentle breeze. There are those who live in death who walk the halls of Farum Azula, and though that particular variant is of a more beastly nature, they still carry the same Sunrealm shields, making them all, Farum Azula, those who live in death, and the Sunrealm, creatures of a single age. Ruminating on these matters as I've done, such striking detail hounds my attention as the fact that Farum Azula seems impervious to the night sky. Long have I awaited by the lost grace with nary a sign of dusk coming round. The sun shines eternal on the firmament of this city, and by that fact I attest without a doubt that it is none other than the seat of the sun, heart of the Sun Realm, if ever there was one to be found. Have you been picturing this city in your mind's eye, friend, in its heyday of glory restored, with a never-fading sun hanging in its skies? Well, allow me, if you will, to complete this picture by proposing that, despite its namesake, the Sun Realm may not have been as incandescent as one might have thought. The Eclipse Shotel employs Prince of Death's flames, born from Godwyn the Golden, slain with a fragment of Melina's Rune of Death. The veiled sun imagery doubles as a crest to both Castle Sol and the Mausoleum Knights, whose records call it an eclipsed sun drained of color. So given these connections and also the black flames Melina was known for, I believe that, in lieu of golden skies, the rule of the Gloam-Eyed Queen may have been graced with a dark sun instead. Now that we've established Melina was this age's ruler, and that the Sun Realm was her kingdom, we should divert our attention to unraveling truths regarding the outer god she served, Destined Death, whom I believe to have been one among a cluster of fire-centric outer gods birthed from the reckoning of the Nox. I first reached this conclusion when I realized realized the age of the Glomide Queen was shared with a number of other flame-related powers, and with their respective deities as well. Let me walk you through my thought process, old friend. Let us start by analyzing the relationship between Destined Death and Ghost Flame, shall we? We know Ghost Flame to be associated with the Eternal Cities, that in the time when there was no Erdtree, death was burned in Ghost Flame, and the death birds were the keepers of that fire. It is also said these birds raked out the ashen remains of the dead from their kilns, diligent little firekeepers that they must have been. But then there are also the Rhosis statues that serve as guide and gatekeeper for those returning to the roots. And what you may have noticed is that these two practices, the burning and raking of the dead and burying the dead among the roots of the great tree, are mutually exclusive, meaning there were two separate applications of Ghost Flame. And the thing is, my old friend, that I believe these two instances to be more than simply separate applications. I believe them to be separated by time. After all, there are no renditions of Rhosis in the Eternal Cities, are there? Not to mention the catacombs where Rhosis can be found are too close to the surface, too close to have survived the level of destruction that nigh erased all trace of Eternal Cities above ground. And lastly, Ghost Flame-lit Rhosis statues guide us to the roots of the great tree, but the overgrowth of these roots can be seen overtaking the nameless Eternal City, implying this tree to have only become as great as is known to be after the fall of that city which shall remain without a name. And what this means, I wager, is that Rhosis represents a later occurrence of this power in the lands between, a remnant of the one god formerly worshipped by the Nox and their civilization. Furthermore, I see very little reason to believe the Golden Order would have bothered to build catacombs with depictions of Rhosis instead of Marika, shining with ghost flame rather than grace. I find it much more reasonable to assume these structures were repurposed, useful as they may be, since the great tree to which they once led eventually became the roots of the Erdtree. And since the coup against the Glomide Queen was the final act preceding the rise of the Golden Order, this also means those catacombs may have been built during Melena's rule. Though without any evidence to the contrary, I suppose one could argue she'd repurpose them, similarly to what Marika did. Luckily for us, such evidence exists. And I'm to tell you now that these two powers, Destined Death and Ghost Flame, can be associated with each other via their outer gods, despite the fact there's no shortage of scholars who believe Melina served no deities. There are no records, they say. Well, more eyes, I tell them. What you need are more eyes, my friends. The records of an item commonly known as Twinbird Kite Shield state that the Twinbird is said to be the envoy of an outer god and mother of the Deathbirds. But here's the thing. This shield's vivid painting is divided in two halves, one red, one blue. Also, its effect stacks with, and its color pattern is repeated by, the red and blue feathered branch swords reminiscent of the Helfin steeples and once used in ancient death rituals. But Deathbirds are simple creatures. They rake and they burn. They peck and they kill. Their relationship with Ghost Flame is likewise a simple and single-minded affair. The concept of duality this shield and these feathers are working so hard to evoke seems fated to remain incomplete unless a counterpart to Ghost Flame can be found. I had already theorized the death of the one god had birthed the outer gods we've come to know, and while it is possible this shield is a reference to a single outer god governing these two powers, given the context in which these new deities were born, I believe this legend's Twinbird to be referencing the two Estelles instead. Just another truth, lost to time, and warped by our meager, limited perspective on things. After all is said and done, I believe what the legend of the Twinbird implies is a close connection between the Helfin's Ghost Flame and the Glomide Queen's Destined Death that goes beyond their shared origin. They exist within a larger cluster but are brought together first thematically through an association to the concept of death, and then visually through Melina's black flames, which likely represent a point of convergence for them. With all that being said, I must now expand on something that, till now, I've only hinted at, which is that I believe theirs to have been a larger cluster encompassing more than just these two. For all evidence indicates the Glomide Queen to have shared the classical era with the Flame of Ruin and the Frenzied Flame as well. Regarding the Flame of Ruin, it must be noted that as the fire giants were defeated by Marika, their failure released them from their solitary curse to serve as keepers of the flame for eternity. This indicates that prior to that war, the role of the giants had already been diminished to simple keepers of the Flame of Ruin. And considering this occupation was seen as a solitary curse, then it also implies it has been used to ostracize and punish them. Giants were either rulers or an upper echelon religious caste in the Eternal Cities, but as their civilizations collapsed, their roles were upended. Such is the fate of the powerful, once they've been forcefully removed from power. There's also a distinct lack of evidence regarding any kind of kingship pertaining to the fire giants during this period of time, whereas the dragons, for instance, had an Elden Lord. When compared to its counterparts, Destined to Death and Ghost Flame, the Flame of Ruin is essentially a more elementary form of flame. And though this characteristic may sound belittling, it might also have conferred a somewhat foundational aspect to the Fell Flame, comparable to a medium permeating their cluster and mediating their interactions with the greater will. Figuratively, this would be an ecclesiastic status that is in keeping with the former role occupied by its giant keepers. The Forge of the Giants, which presumably holds the star debris of the one-eyed fell god, even resembles a ritual pot, don't you think? This notion is further corroborated by the Divine Towers, whose fingers clearly indicate they were used in a similar fashion. First, let us acknowledge that these towers would have been hard-pressed to survive the destruction of the Eternal Cities and are therefore more recent structures. Then, after some observation, one must also realize they possess no visual references to either Grace or the Golden Order. Instead, what they do have are interior walls reminiscent of the star-dotted underground Eternal Cities, and most notably, they also have very predominant depictions of a molten core meteorite encircled with 8 spheres, which correlates perfectly with the one eye of the fell god, as revealed by the last remaining fire giant when he pleaded with his god for the power to vanquish his foes. Us. And there are a few side notes written along the sides here, apparently related to this same Flame of Ruin subject. It should be noted that while Rosus is referenced as an entity unto itself, the Helfen seem to be a reference to either a structure or the material from which such structure was built. The black steeple of the Helfen, the lampwood which guides the dead to the spirit world. I was prompted to make this distinction after having been asked about it by a fellow scholar with an odd panache for slamming flour-based dishes into furniture. The one-eyed pattern is also present on the hammers of the trolls, who are descendants of the giants, and is similar to the pattern of the watchdog's staff as well. The latter is a less conclusive comparison, but given the context, it could be used to associate the Rosus catacombs with the fell god of the Flame of Ruin, making them contemporary forces. And finally, the molten cores of the Divine Towers seem to be a smaller instance of the same kind of meteorite found at the bottom of various mines. Going back to the main text of the letter. Regarding the frenzied flame, first and foremost, we should remind ourselves that the madness-inducing Miranda of Noxtella implies this outer god was born from the same event that spawned the ones we've been talking about. One of the most interesting sources of information regarding this power comes perhaps from Hiera, the Finger Maiden, who makes chaos out to be an absolute creationist deity, when she says, "All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures and births and souls. But the greater will made a mistake, and so what was borrowed must be returned, and melted all away, until all is one again." But there is no evidence to back an interpretation where the one great is the frenzied flame. Nothing to indicate chaos created the whole of existence. This would be, after all, way beyond the scope of that which is to be expected from an outer god. In this sense, another example attributing more to deities than we ought to is the belief that grace houses the power of life itself, when we know that to be simply categorically untrue, given that life predates the arrival of grace in the lands between. The truth is unveiled by realizing that history, or rather our retelling of it, is a matter of perspective. Just like we currently label the rule of Placidusax as prehistoric and Godfrey as the true first Elden Lord, the origin spoken of by Hieta isn't the origin of all things, just that of the frenzied flame. And given the theories laid out thus far, the one great she mentions can be understood partly as the original form of the Greater Will, the one god of the Nox and the eternal cities. It should also be noted that fingers have a track record of preaching about matters they don't fully comprehend, as exemplified by the two fingers of the hold. They only know that which they are told by their respective deities. And also that taking Hieta's words as an absolute value wherein the one great created all things and all life creates an instance of circular reasoning. According to her, the shattering of the one great created all things, which includes the Greater Will. But also according to her, the Greater Will caused the shattering of the one great. The one great's shattering created the Greater Will, who produced the shattering of the one great, who created the Greater Will. There is no logic in this interpretation. A change in perspective is surely required. Still within this context, we should also consider the placement of the three fingers. It resides between the nameless eternal city and Leyndell, which is figurative of the same period of transition ruled by the Gloamite Queen. That location is also not found within Leyndell proper. The structure that surrounds it is a Rosas catacomb. The conclusion is that it was originally imprisoned by its own kin, rather than any grace-given force, presumably due to the destructiveness that its presence represents. All of these conclusions, I might add, bring new context to Melena's grudge against the Lord of Frenzied Flame. So these are the outer gods whose presence marked this age one way or another. But before we move on to discussing the Empyreans and the history they'd soon unfold, there is still one more aspect pertaining to the Sun Realm that warrants some exploration. The primordial crucible, where all life was once blended together, embodies the aspects of various creatures, which were considered a signifier of the divine in ancient times. It's unclear whether this divine status was derived from or granted to the ancient dragons, but the fact remains that they personify all aspects associated with the crucible: fire, feathers, knots, horns, and tails. And it's interesting to note that this apparent deification of hybrids bleeds into the very fabric of their society, giving rise to a highly stratified hierarchy. I think the beastmen can be intuitively understood to be hybrids rather than their own species, since they not only look like a crossbreed between beast and man, but human bone shards can also be acquired from their bodies. The fact that they, or pretty much any other hybrids for that matter, are missing from the eternal cities implies most amalgamated species came to be during this particular period of time. A conclusion that is in accordance with the common belief that beasts were granted intelligence somehow. And also with the tales of godskin nobles, most ancient among Melena's apostles, who are said to have assimilated in human physiology. These nobles clearly belong to a higher stratum, and the beastmen too must have belonged in a similarly well-regarded caste, given they themselves and their remains can seldom be found outside of Farum Azula. There are even statues in this city that imply beast clergymen comprise the highest order of priests of their time. Below this caste of crossbreeds were the humans inhabiting the continent, with the coexistence of both man and beastman in the same period of time, demonstrated by the fact that both these variants, when found among those who lived in death, bear the same Sun Realm kind of shield. The physical placement of Farum Azula and its beasts above the continent is figurative in this dynamic as well. Still within this context, it's worth noting humans were buried in ghost flame-lit catacombs connected to the Great Tree, where the beastmen were buried on site within Farum Azula and the Bestial Sanctum. This demonstrates the ruling power destined to death was entitled to hybrids seen as divine, while Ghost Flame was relegated to non-amalgamated species that were effectively second-class citizens of their own kingdom. And lastly, harpies may have served as clerics, mediating the space between castes, considering their presence in the continent but not in Farum Azula, their priest-like ornamentation and hybrid appearance, and the fact some of them can cast necromantic spells. As previously theorized, the presence of outer gods can have an influence on the biological life surrounding it, which is demonstrated among other examples by different kinds of butterflies and Miranda flowers, the golden laced eyes of the grace given, and all the crystal-covered, sleep-inducing, or Prince of Death's face-bearing crabs of the lands between. It should be of little surprise, then, that the sudden onset of so many gods at once could result in such synthesis of life forms as we've just discussed. For the future of this world, this also meant that the essence of all life was now intermingled, which incidentally explains both the runes found in animals such as tumbling goats and charging boars, and also the henceforth inclusion of the great and Erd trees in this ungodly process of churning life itself into material resources to be extracted, consumed, replaced, repeat. All this can be used to expand upon our understanding of the crucible as well. As it turns out, this was no manner of place or thing, and it wasn't any sort of ethereal philosophical concept either. It was, simply put, one very specific point in time. Remember that the crucible is called the primordial form of the Erd tree, which corresponds to the point in time when grace arrived in the lands between. The conclusion being that this was the period of time following the fall of the eternal cities, all the way through the rise of the crossbreeds and ending with the establishment of the Golden Order. A conclusion that complements our previous definition of the One Great, since the shattering of the one God gave rise to the Crucible. For the Sun Realm, this was illustrated by beastmen and dragons. Nowadays, the lingering effects of that era are exemplified by the misbegotten, who are held to be a punishment for making contact with the Crucible, and who are called hybrids in the land of reeds. And also by the horn-covered omens, among whom Morgoth and Moog, like the ancient dragons before them, came to embody all aspects of the Crucible between themselves. This transition on how hybrids are perceived, with their various aspects being increasingly disdained as an impurity, was to be expected after the upcoming shift in power, since their association with a previous reign would naturally be looked down upon by the New World Order. Two more side notes here, saying, another sign of the transition from the ancient to the classical era is the shift from sorceries to incantations. All ancient spells are sorceries, and most modern sorceries are associated with ancient concepts. Incantations are a more recent development, and the domain of the new outer gods. And the characteristic imagery of horns and trees associated with the Crucible Knights symbolize the merging of the previously excluded fauna and flora into the resource extraction system used by the gods. Going back to the ancient dragons just one last time, we are presented with an interesting possibility when coupling dragon communion with this newly developed understanding of the Crucible and the hybridization therein. We know dragons existed during the ancient era due to the presence of the dragonkin in eternal cities. This correlates with the dragon communion seal, which states that dragon communion is too primal in nature for the term incantation to be appropriate. It also fits the fact that both this seal and dragon communion spells have an arcane requirement, which has been previously associated with the eternal cities. So if the influence of outer gods was enough to create such hybrids as beastmen, the omen, and the misbegotten, then by retroactively applying this concept to the ancient era, it's reasonable to assume the power of the one god may have created such arcane-infused ancient hybrids as the dragons and their dragon kin. Possibly even purposely, dare I say. Incidentally, this connection could also explain the pitch-dark skin of the modern draconic people. There's no explicit reason for their skin to possess such hue, which is often described as stone-like, but that lacks any actual stone-like features. But if the dragons of old had been created by the god of the Nox, then the draconic people would actually be descended from the Nox, who, by virtue of having been forgotten by history, were replaced by dragons in their mythos instead. Now, dragon communion spells are related to aspects that are either intrinsic to dragons as a species, e.g. dragon claw, or that have become intrinsic to individual dragons from which they are derived, e.g. rotten breath. As such, these powers all have an arcane component, are affected by the dragon communion seal, and require the caster to consume dragon hearts that will, in turn, alter the physiology of the caster themselves, making them more attuned to the nature of dragons and allowing them to conjure such draconic powers. Lightning attacks, such as Lansak's Glaive, are powers they are summoning from without, not from within, just like a human summoning a lightning bolt. And their red hue is a signifier of the rune of death they served. Thus the arcane aspect is missing, and any one individual can learn to cast them through simple study as exemplified by Vika's Dragon Bolt. This explains why not all ancient dragons in Farum Azula can wield such powers, simply haven't learned them yet. And it also sets Placidusax ruin apart. Placidusax's golden breath might give the impression he was grace-given, which is particularly misleading in the sense that it skews the timeline of grace in the lands between. But given that this spell lacks the requirements associated with dragon communion, arcane and dragon hearts, we can infer that the golden element of his breath attack is not, in fact, intrinsic to his being. What we see when he spews forth this kind of flame is akin to regurgitating the poison that kills you. These are the dying wails of the Dragon Lord, and grace was his ruin. The last and perhaps most interesting revelation that can be gleaned from this subject is that given the right circumstances, even rot can become part of a dragon's nature. This implies that of all the powers we've talked about, grace may be the only one not derived from the one god who possibly originated dragonkind, the one truly eldritch deity among a host of alien gods. Erstwhile sovereignty. In the land between lands of the lands between, there are gods and there are lesser gods of a different breed, a different kind. Regarding these so-called goddesses, Melina and Marika, while their position may be granted by the outer gods, the possibility of ascension must first come through the title of Empyrean. Here, today, all three Empyreans are siblings, which gives rise to the possibility the first two were sisters as well. Inbred royalty bickering over power has dictated the fate of our world since time immemorial. It's the same old story, everywhere I go. The hell with it all. In any event, Marika and Melina's ancestry is never explicitly delineated by any records I was able to procure. But it's safe to say they aren't gods in the same sense we've come to understand that concept. They weren't spawned fully formed by divine intervention. Marika, for one, is known to belong to the race of the Numen, who are said to have come from outside the lands between. And even though no such information is given in regards to Melina, some insight can be gained from a closer observation of Farum Azula. There we find statues depicting a human-like king, his queen, and his progeny. And since Farum was ruled by a queen whose consort was a dragon, then these statues must represent Melina's lineage. There is also a statue of a young girl surrounded by 3 wolves in Malekith's arena. And the fact these wolves numbered 3 may be more relevant than what first impressions may suggest. To elaborate on this point, a series of connections can be made, each relatively insubstantial on its own, but forming a reasonably solid foundation when put together that helps to validate the possibility of kinship between the Glomide Queen and Queen Marika the Eternal. First, it must be noted that the wolves depicted in Farum's shrine should be emblematic of shadowbound beasts, which are given to the Empyrean. And considering these wolves numbered 3, then an equal number of Empyreans might be implied, a number that correlates perfectly with Rani, Mikola, and Melania's familial bonds. Then, regarding the statues of the royal family, it's worth noting the image of the queen holding a baby has a tendency to be repeated in numbers of 3. Not always, mind you, just enough times to entice a scholar's curiosity. Moving away from the crumbling city, we look toward a seemingly unrelated location known as the Three Sisters in Caria Manor. The implication of its name is obvious, meaning this place was named after, well, 3 sisters. A fact reinforced by the presence of its 3 towers, and the repeating of this pattern in the Moonlight Altar, another location connected to the Carians, in the form of 3 maiden statues guarded by a red wolf. But who are these 3 sisters a reference to? Princess Rani is the natural starting point for this line of inquiry, given one of the towers is named after her. But one very quickly realizes she had 2 brothers, Rykard and Radahn, but no sisters to speak of. And despite Rani's tower being named after her, the same can be said about Seluvis's Rise, even though the presumptuous old conjurer is obviously nobody's sister. And regarding Renna's Rise, the truth comes from Iji when he says, Lady Rani's departed on her journey, along the dark path of the Empyrean from Renna's Rise, as she calls it. Meaning that's how Rani chooses to call that tower, regardless of its original name, with Renna possibly serving as a nickname for her mother, Renala. This indicates the current naming of these towers does not reflect their original titles, and Rani is therefore not necessarily to be counted among the 3 sisters in this location's namesake. And Renala herself was a possibility that had crossed my mind, but likewise there's no indication to be found of her having had any siblings, no matter how hard I may have looked for it. At this point, I must admit I was stumped. With no more leads to follow, I briefly entertained ignorance of such matters as the final outcome of this incursion. But in that moment of respite, I'm glad that hope did not falter, for there is one last person of interest in association with these towers, the ever-elusive Snow Witch. Not much is known about her outside the relationship she shared with Ranni. What we do know, however, is that she's a character of some importance since she was allowed to tutor the Lunar Princess, that she's privy to ancient knowledge, given she spoke of the Dark Moon to the young Empyrean. And most importantly, we know the old crone was a witch immersed in frost magic, which is not so unlike Ghost Flame that this power too causes frost buildup. The implication being that the Snow Witch was also an Empyrean, a sister to both Marika and Melina, and that she served as the figurehead to the power of Ghost Flame in the Sun Realm. Something that helps us link these three sisters back to Melina and Marika are the otherwise unassuming King's Realm ruins, last line of defense of Caria Manor. What drew my attention to it is the simple mention of a King's Realm. A kingdom led by a king is unprecedented in the history of the lands between. The queen is always the head of state in every age we have records for. The only vestige there is of such an occurrence are the royal family statues of Farum Azula, which prominently display their king, the position likely maintained by his family after their ascension to rulers of the entire continent, up until the moment such tradition was broken by his own daughter, the Glomide Queen. They must have spread out from Liurnia onto the uplands left behind by the Eternal Cities. They blazed new trails to the rain-drenched fields of the Weeping Peninsula, and carved winding paths into the cliffs leading to the snowy mountaintops of the giants, conquering all who stood in their way. And after the grandeur of this revelation has waned, its final conclusion of any consequence to our discussion is that their lineage makes the Snow Witch a grandmother to the Lunar Princess, and explains how she was able to influence her to the extent that she did. Within this context, Marika served the Flame of Ruin in the same manner Melina and the Snow Witch served destined death in the Ghost Flame. This can be surmised by the fact the First Church of Marika is located in the mountaintops of the Giants, meaning that's where she started her campaign, rather than the more intuitive alternative of Leyndell. Another piece of evidence to this end comes from one of her paintings in the Round Table Hold, where she's depicted as a red-haired maiden, given the association drawn between that hair color and the fire giants who tended to the Flame of Ruin. The paintings in the Hold are all either of Godfrey, the Erdtree, or Marika, and there's no reason to assume this one isn't of her as well, especially considering the similarity between the crown she wears in this painting to Godfrey's crown. Also, Marika's churches are usually associated with her godhood, but the fact her first church predates the defeat of the Glomide Queen, given the war against the fire giants predates the war against the dragons, implies she occupied a religious position since before her ascension, which complements the previously theorized religious status conferred to the Fell Flame. And finally, there's also the possibility that Marika's particular brand of priesthood involved some sort of spirit calling. You see, Melina gifts the Tarnished with the spectral steed whistle that summons Torrent. Ranni also gifts us with a spirit-calling bell and the lone wolf ashes on behest of Torrent's former master. All these gifts imply Torrent's former master was a spirit caller, or a spirit tuner, as we're more accustomed to calling such people. The three wolves summoned by those ashes are reminiscent of the three Empyreans and their shadows. Now, given Ranni's lineage, one might be inclined to believe Torrent's master might have been the Snow Witch, but there's no reason to assume the witch had any involvement in Marika's plans regarding the Tarnished, meaning there's little reason why she'd have left these gifts. And in her current form, there's no clear association between Melina and that witch either, making Marika an intersection of both possibilities, and the most likely candidate to have owned Torrent. With this in mind, the proximity between the First Church of Marika and the Spirit Caller Cave, where Godskin apostles have curiously died, is infused with some significance, which, albeit initially circumstantial, is compounded by the association this region has to spirits in general, considering even plants and trees become spirits here, and that this is the only place where we have any hints regarding the origin of the spirit jellyfishes. Another piece of this puzzle might come from the relationship between the blacksmith Hugh and the unspecified spirit tuner he talks about, after Roderika relocates to the Round Table Hold. Marika is the only other character he mentions having known, making the possibility she could have been this spirit tuner a fair assumption, even if not yet particularly credible. The only definitive clue we have of that spirit tuner's identity is that they had green eyes, of the same hue as Roderika's. There isn't much information about Roderika's past, but we know for a fact that she was royalty. In the lands between, this makes her statistically likely to have been related to Marika to some degree, meaning she may have inherited Marika's original eye color from before she was bestowed with the golden hues of the grace given. Just as with the Spirit Color Cave, this connection is initially circumstantial, but it can be built upon using the counterpart to Roderika's Crimson Hood. Godfrey wears a cape of the same blue navy color, which seems an unlikely choice for him, until we read the records pertaining to the navy hood. Worn by expatriated royalty, such cloaks were gifted to those who departed on missions to faraway lands, from which they would never return. But what choice did they have, having seen the guidance of grace? The color, along with this undeniably fitting description for Godfrey, implies his was one such kind of hood. That also helps to connect the generalized notion of royalty that comes from these hoods, and by extension from Roderika, to Marika's very specific royal lineage. And I tell you now that the identity of my companion's former master is a mystery I've long wished to unravel. Though I must say, the scholar in me rejoiced a great deal more from the enriched understanding I've gained about Marika's way of life and the systems that govern the Sun Realm. There's no telling which clues might be the most valuable when piecing together puzzles that stretch across space and time. But for what it's worth, I'm at least glad to have a more complete picture of history that I can gaze upon in wonder. I must state for the record that there is a slew of side notes, all hastily scribbled, some bearing a kind of language this archivist can't fully comprehend. Whatever might have been happening, it seems to have been taking a toll on the writer of these letters. Side notes are as follows. In the land of reeds, the Numen are referenced with this kanji. This term refers to gods and spirits in the context of a bygone folklore tradition related to villages entertaining such entities as they visited from distant heavenly lands. This practice has mostly died out in modern times and was brought to mainstream studies by the scholar Shinobu Orokuchi. Given all that's been disclosed thus far, another small hint connecting the three sisters to Farum Azula are the three wolves standing guard in front of Rani's rise, like the three wolves in Malekith's altar. In light of the level of his dedication to Marika, the nameless tarnished mentioned by the lone wolf Ashes may have been Vargrim, the raging wolf. Vargrim was in fact not nameless, but the word translated as nameless tarnished means stray person, as in a stray wolf. These next three notes seem particularly out of place. From a meta perspective only, when Rani approaches us at the behest of Torrent's former master, she gifts us on behalf of our previous characters in an infinitely repeating cycle. Radagon plus Marika equals Roderika equals Roderika, not to be taken as a serious argument unless you want to. Outside sources of information aren't canon. The following aren't arguments, they're side notes. At the core of the Elden Ring lies a Triketra. This emblem is used to symbolize, among other things, Celtic and Wiccan triple goddesses, as in the Empyreans, and the phases of the moon as an analogy for the phases of life, death, and rebirth. In Wicca, the consort of the female triple goddess of the moon is the Horned God, who is represented by Godfrey and his association with Sirach and the Crucible Knights. The Horned God is associated with nature, wilderness, sexuality, hunting, and the life cycle. He's often depicted as having a beast's head, emphasizing the union of the divine and the animal, which includes humanity. In traditional Wicca, he's generally regarded as a god of twofold aspects, bright and dark summer and winter, the Oak King and the Holly King, Godfrey, Elden Lord, and Horalu, warrior. In the land of reeds, the Triketra is referenced with this kanji, and is one of the 10 major family crests. It's associated with the oak, and regarded as sacred for having been used as a vessel for offerings since ancient times. Farum might stem from the word ferum, first-person plural passive junctive of fera, which is Old Norse for going, passage, while Azula seems like it's derived from the word azul, which means blue in Spanish and Portuguese. If true, that'd make Farum Azula's name figuratively a pathway to the firmament or heavens. Just what was the writer talking about? Is there yet another world we should be looking for? March of the Golden Queen. Well, my friend, the road was long, but the stage is set. Long have I scoured ruins and temples for clues. Long have I been writing these words unto you. We know now of a vast kingdom under a dark sun, of its queen and her sisters and their gods. We know now of what was, but still we must talk of what would come. Alas, my candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But ah, my foes, and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light. So in these wee hours let us sit about and speak feverishly, for just a spell longer, for as long as this blaze can still be seen. It's high time we talked about America's war. Stray, my old friend, let us talk about the march of the Golden Queen. Empyreans as they may be, all signs point to America and the Snow Witch serving under Melina from a lower caste, just like everyone else. As we've theorized, America served beside the Flame of Ruin in a priestess-like capacity. But the fire giants who shared the same occupation were subdued into what is seen as a cursed and lonely fate, meaning America's was likewise not a position of as much prestige as she may have hoped. The Snow Witch and her ghost flame as well, as we've shown before, were relegated to tending the processing of less than first-class citizens. And the Zamorians, who are the group most likely to have been associated with her given their ice sorceries, all wear chains around their wrists, which indicates they too shared a similar fate to giants of the fell flame. And perhaps the most damning piece of evidence, the Gloam-Eyed Queen's apostles were already known by their godskin denomination. Divine sacrifices of America's ilk were evidently needed for their noble god hunt, and the goddess only knows how many of her brethren must have fallen. The rule of destined death must have been a grim and dreadful thing indeed. Being the vessel to a grace-given vision, it's conceivable that America had effectively become a doll, puppeteered by the greater will. But in the end, it's impossible to determine America's motives with any degree of certainty. Regardless, she seems to have channeled the malcontent of Melina's subjects into a popular revolt, an insurrection made up of barbarians from the Badlands, freed Zamorian prisoners, lesser giants, and banished knights. Now, Stray, I want you to imagine these words of America echoed by Melina in one of her own churches, as I should imagine you grinning at the irony of this situation. Hark, my Lord Godfrey, we commend your deeds. Guidance has delivered ye through ordeal to the place ye now stand. Put the giants to the sword, and confine the flame atop the mount. Let a new epoch begin, an epoch glistening with life. Brandish the Elden Ring, for the age of the Erdtree. Judging by these words, it's clear that she already had plans to take over the Great Tree, and it's also certain she had already come into contact with Grace when she launched her offensive against the giants, though it's unclear when or how. And it's interesting to note that she may have had something akin to an Elden Ring of her own already by the time she let loose her hordes of war. If true, it would have been a single ring, though, before its assimilation into Melina's Elden Ring. Grace had made its first move, America's path laid bare in front of her, and the world would tremble under the weight of their feet. America's next step, implied by her second church in the Altus Plateau, was to convert the Great Tree into the Erdtree. She'd be assisted in this effort by the Empyrean overseer of Ghost Flame, the Snow Witch, who is reasonably assumed to have sided with her given that the Zamorians fought for the Erdtree, and also that she survived at least long enough to have met and taught Lunar Princess Rani. Now, the witch's connection to the catacombs, and by extension to the Great Tree, is probably one of the reasons Marika sought her as an ally in the first place. But her usefulness went beyond that. As her namesake would imply, Snow itself was likely her first contribution to Marika's war, though it would not be the last. Whilst heading toward the grand lift of Rold immediately after descending through an elevator, I caught my first glimpse of Snow on a narrow path surrounded by red streams of energy that stand out against the dull backdrop of the Forbidden Lands. And surely there'd be no reason to question the Snow I later encountered in the mountaintops given their altitude, but nonetheless, something was amiss in this particular instance. We go down from Leyndell into the Forbidden Lands, meaning that the same place on a higher altitude has nothing but lush vegetation, with no hint of snow anywhere in sight. It didn't really make sense to me. That's not how snow was supposed to work. But lacking any hint of an explanation, I thought it best to set such questions aside for the moment. Then, as I reached the peaks of this world, one very hidden, very unassuming location would compound upon such previous notions, making them a jarring and unnerving feeling I could no longer ignore. In the Cave of the Forlorn, I was greeted with the sight of a dragon of all things, halfway submerged into what seemed like a frozen lake of crystal clear ice. And in both the appearance of the ice and the placement of the dragon, it all felt very unnatural to me. But I had heard tale of a phenomenon called flash freezing, and it occurred to me that something similar might have taken place here as well. And in that moment, the history of these entire snow-laden landscapes opened up to me. You see, one of the most puzzling oddities of this place are the spirit trees that dot the terrain and the spirit animals that roam among them. I knew there had to be some significance to it, a point made all the more assertive under the gaze of the Erd tree, and I came to believe they served to tell the story of how the climate here had changed. The spirit trees are all conifers, without exception. This seems intuitive enough given the altitude and the snow, but there are other trees here as well, though some are dead trunks of what look like representatives of a deciduous forest instead. Some overlap between these two types is common enough. We see it in the lands beneath these mountaintops, for instance, but it does strike me as odd in this environment. Not only that, the ones growing out of the freezing lake where Borealis resides seem to corroborate my previous sentiment regarding the possibility of a flash freeze. And lastly, it must be noted that even though they are all here now, together, in one way or another, only the members of the coniferous forest became ghosts of their former selves. What this tells me is that when whatever occurrence that caused them to become as such took place, something I'll be discussing in more depth with you on a later date, these were the only trees that were alive. At that point in time, all the fauna and flora of the region were transformed, but the deciduous forest was already dead. Does it become clear now, Stray? Can you already see it? This place once had a much warmer climate, better suited to the same kind of deciduous forest we see in the continent below. These peaks were the domain of the fire giants and their flame god after all. But the flash freeze, most likely caused by the Snow Witch's frost magic with the purpose of dampening the heat of Marika's foes, made it too inhospitable. Those earlier trees died off, and the conifers moved in. Such is the way of nature, I suppose. Life always finds a way. Furthermore, I believe this scenario can be corroborated by the plentiful, smoldering angiosperms scattered throughout the region, and also by those red streams of light I'd mentioned, the ones sighted in the Forbidden Lands. Just as the ghostly streams of Raya Lucaria precede the cosmos-attuned nature of that institution, or the golden streams of light lead to the sites of grace, those red streams are more befitting of a warm and fiery environ, not this barren, snow-covered land. And I understand, my old friend, that accepting this concept is no easy task, but this conclusion is what all evidence points to. It is also the only way I can make sense of the dynamics of the Forbidden Lands. A more feeble instance of this effect can even arguably be found elsewhere, in the Moonlight Altar Plateau, where something akin to snowfall takes place at an altitude not in keeping with this weather, which is also shared by Noxtella sleeping in its underground. Whether it's here or there, one should keep in mind that these forces we wield without understanding, that we contend with in the face of despair, they act as hyper-objects from which there is no escape, and that change the nature of all that comes into contact with them, be that a mere human's limited ken or the world that surrounds them. You and I have seen worlds fashioned from nightmares, and in these lands who bear witness to crimson rotten fields and eternally billowing storm-front skies, where even the night can be made manifest where by rights there should be none. Should it really be that difficult to entertain such possibility, that this mountaintop's boreal climate was summoned instead of naturally developed? And it's worth remembering that though the ghost flame that Rosa's catacombs channeled the continental dead to the Great Tree, all resources were directed to the Greater Will, which is to say, to destined death. With destined death's connection to the Great Tree being illustrated by the depiction of the Elden Ring in Malekith's arena, which is interwoven with sprawling roots, making that tree a prime objective for Marika, not only in the effort of building the foundations for the system she hoped to rule, but also as a military target that'd allow her to cut off her enemy's supply line. After her victory over the fire giants, having since secured the Great Tree for herself, Marika's advance seems to have come to a halt while she built up her forces. And this is a good moment for us to acknowledge there's really no way to gauge how long this conflict may have lasted. Not only were Marika and her Badland warriors already grace-given at this point, not only are all Newmen said to be long-lived, but all of these three Empyreans were attuned to powers beyond our ken as well. Why should the Undying care for the passage of time that has no bearing on their being? What's it to them whether thousands, if not tens of thousands of moons must first pass before this or that next step is to be taken? Doesn't this make the presence of the Three Sisters Rises alongside the King's Realm that much more likely? They might have been present for their father's conquest of the continent, however long that might have taken him, should they have lived the Newman's lifetime rather than the meager lifespan humans are limited to. Armed with his mindset, it is that much easier to understand how Godwyn instead of Godfrey may have fought in the routing of the ancient dragons, which followed Gransack's assault on the Erd Tree. It is also much easier to realize Leyndell as it stands today did not exist yet when Marika arrived at the seat of power of her future kingdom. As I made my way toward the capital, having just fought 2 tree sentinels standing guard, I was vexed to find a locked gate at its western outer walls. What I didn't know then was that this same gate would garner my attention at a not-so-distant time in the future. What I would later find interesting about this gate wasn't the fact that it is locked, it was the fact that it doesn't connect to anything on the other side. There is another locked gate on the capital signs that stands in the direction of the first, implying one should lead to the other, but there's naught but a moat betwixt them, with no bridge or road that would make traversal possible. That seemed like such an odd feature to me. Luckily, the solution to this puzzle would not elude me for long. I believe I have found the answer to this mystery in the path leading to the Cathedral of the Forsaken. In lieu of golden avenues adorned with golden trees, the way to that cathedral must be traversed across a sewage system beneath Leyndell, which was later repurposed to also serve as the shunning grounds. But the scale of its halls and even the presence of its shrines might give one the impression these pipelines were added to a previously existing structure, which is, in fact, the precise impression it caused on me. This is compounded by the underground roadside Site of Grace, whose name implies an actual road system existed here sometime in the past. But then there's the pit where the Forsaken Depths Site of Grace is found. Currently, the elevator that takes us down there is the only way of reaching it, but there are winding stone staircases leading up toward the capital, culminating in a level with wooden floors. This means the Rosa-styled Cathedral of the Forsaken was once directly connected to the city above it. This pit is, in turn, located directly below the buildings east of the gate, connecting to the ashen-filled path that leads to the Divine Tower of East Altus and the Grand Lift of Rold. We can't see the ceiling of the pit from the Site of Grace, only the light shining down from it and the water pouring down its walls. Here's the thing, though. Considering the light shining through, it is simply impossible for this pit to be located below those buildings. And, well, due to the certainty of this impossibility, I can only attribute this trick of the light to an oversight by the otherwise perfect gods and goddesses who created this world virtually as if plucked from out their heads. Veritable artists, the lot of them. They seem to have treated this one particular instance as if it were merely a game. In any case, notwithstanding such light tricks, it is much more likely that this pit is actually located beneath the moat between the aforementioned buildings and ashen path, with both light and water coming through the collection of rocks that forms its bottom. All this implies the moats and Leyndell itself were built on top of a pre-existing city, a city that was a part of the Sun Realm, connected to the roots of the Great Tree, and responsible for the imprisonment of the Three Fingers and the Frenzied Flame. So going back to my previous point regarding the extent of time the conflict between Melina and Marika may have persisted for, The point of these arguments is that after having reached the Altus Plateau, enough time had passed before Farum Azula launched a counterattack that an entire city had been built, and Godwyn had grown into a full-fledged warrior capable of combating the ancient dragons themselves. After the dragons were repelled from the Erdtree's capital, Marika resumed her southward march. There, among the Liurnian lakes, the sorcerers had long established a bastion built on a foundation of glintstone. The sun engravings in Raya Lucaria indicate they were loyal to Melena's sun realm, and the library's black sun in particular helps to corroborate the idea of a black sun hanging from its skies. This is probably when the First Liurnian War took place, as soon as her forces set out from the Altus Plateau. But Marika's goal lay elsewhere, so she left Liurnia unconquered, and her march carried on. This is indicated by the third and fourth churches of Marika in Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula. And even though Limgrave had already been previously associated with Farum Azula, I believe our exploration would benefit from making a note regarding the banished Knights of Stormvale. The draconic ornamentation of their armors indicates they were once Knights of the Sun Realm, much like the Storm King must have served as one of its vassals. But they weren't all loyalists, as it turns out. In view of the many banished knight armor sets stored away both in Leyndell proper and the Round Table Hold, a number of them seem to have sided with Marika. And we may even be privy to her conscription speech through Melena's retelling of her words, saying, "The Erdtree governs all. The choice is thine. Become one with the order, or divest thyself of it, to wallow at the fringes, a powerless upstart." Thus, Marika and her grace-given vision saw fit to make a stand in this particular stretch of the continent, having forsaken dominion over Liurnia in its entirety. And interestingly enough, there is no fifth Church of Marika in Caelid, as it would have been expected, given its even closer connection to Farum Azula, final destination of Marika's war. And I believe the reason for it is that the primary force brought to bear against Melena's citadel was created in Limgrave itself, though I would ask that you allow me the indiscretion of addressing the final blow first, before we delve into the mysteries of Limgrave. Despite having faced the Stormlord alone, i.e. Placidusax, Godfrey didn't deliver the killing blow to the Dragonlord. We did. And likewise, something other than Hoarah obviously destroyed Farum Azula as well. The ruins dotting the landscape of the lands between share the same architectural style as Farum Azula. Their ruin fragments are believed to have once been part of a temple in the sky. The ruin it came from crumbled when struck by a meteorite. In ancient times, the stars were guided by the moon of Noxtella, but there's no direct link indicating that Nox or Estelle were involved in this incident. But considering this was a period of transition from destined death to grace, and that the Greater Will sent a golden star bearing a beast into the lands between, then the celestial body that bore the Elden Beast is the most likely candidate to have brought Farum Azula to ruin. And it's worth noting that, at that time, Farum Azula was possibly located above the gulf south of the Erdtree, which would place the city at the center of all divine towers. This would explain how those ruins could have spread so far throughout the continent. It would imply the gulf may have been formed due to the impact that destroyed Farum, and place Ground Zero close enough to the Erdtree to make this possibility all the more reasonable, considering that's where the Elden Beast can be found now. Another clue to this conclusion is that despite having fought the Dragonlord, Godfrey's campaign seems to have ended at the outskirts of Caelid, which is relevant, considering Farum's current proximity to that part of the continent. Lord Godfrey, at the end of his campaign, his golden army is unvanquished and unbowed, yet finds grace lost, tattered and faded. Sword inscription, smoldering church. And one last hint regarding this theory is found in the isolated divine tower standing at the entrance to the gulf. This is the only divine tower with visible damage to its structure on the topmost level, where a section of the parapet facing Farum Azula has been destroyed. This is a small and circumstantial sign, but it might be a remnant from the bombardment of Farum Azula, which has set the city and its legacy slowly drifting toward the sea ever since. Going back to Limgrave, beneath Stormvale Castle, there is a body like that which Godwyn has become, the Prince of Death. This body is older than Godwyn's, though. Besides being buried under a massive amount of rubble, Stormvale's Prince of Death is also missing its eyes, an indication it's been trapped in a death-like state for a longer period of time. Another piece of evidence supporting this conclusion is that there one can also find Rancor Call, an ancient death hex once thought lost, that was rediscovered by the necromancer Garrus. The curse mark of Death Crest, materialized when casting such spells, associates this death hex to the Prince of Death, and the fact it had to be rediscovered in Outrage implies the powers to which it is associated to have belonged to an age long gone. And finally, all this along with the presence of Ghost Flame around Stormvale's Prince of Death implies the ritual that created it to have happened during the Age of the Crucible, the same age in which Marika had taken over this castle. Marika's background as a spirit caller may serve as answer to how this ritual was developed, though, given the implied connection between this brand of necromancy and Ghost Flame, it's possible the Snow Witch may have assisted in some capacity as well. Now, if Marika was responsible for this ritual, then the next step would be to figure out why this Elder Prince was created in the first place. And to that end, there are two lessons we can learn from Godwyn: that a fragment of the Rune of Death is required for the ritual, and that such bodies are the source of both Deathroot and Deathblight. Regarding the rune, we must remind ourselves that the Gloam-Eyed Queen was an Empyrean, and that just like Marika had Malekith, Melina would have had a shadow of her own. And just like Malekith is the current guardian of the Rune of Death, I believe Gurranq, the beast clergyman, was the shadow-bound beast previously charged with that responsibility. And I've heard other scholars claiming Gurranq to be Malekith himself, but that's untrue. Gurranq outlasts Malekith's death. They're neither the same individual, nor is Gurranq a projection of Malekith a la Margit. The statues of beast clergymen in Farum Azula also imply a whole cast of them, making the initial assumption, frankly, completely unnecessary. His death throes, Marika, why wouldst thou gull me, reveal he had some sort of arrangement with Marika. So having provided her with the fragment she needed, he and his sanctum were spared the sheer terror of her, and the Elden Ring he served remained, albeit in another form. Though like the lonely fire giant before him, Gurranq too would learn that mercy can be a curse in its own right. His deed did not go unpunished. The Elden Ring was shattered, and his death hunger shall be sated nevermore. In the subject of shadow-bound beasts, I'd like to note that regarding Malekith, the kanji in his records that was translated as half-brother can be more accurately translated as step-brother. The former implies a blood relation, the latter does not. Next, regarding Deathroot and Blight, we learn from observation that both these things are present in Farum Azula. Suspiciously so, I might add. They are ultimately associated with destined death, yes, but destined death by itself does not give rise to Deathroot. The Prince of Death does. So even though their presence there explains the beastmen, those who live in death, the origin of these roots must still be unearthed. It should also be noted that the worm faces in Farum Azula are dressed in accordance to their location, meaning that unlike their Altus counterparts, these ones were original residents of the crumbling city. And despite the distances in space and time that separate them, the fact that the Altus variant inhabits that which is known as the Woodfolk Ruins might indicate all of them became afflicted with Deathblight due to a deeper connection to the flora through which Deathroot proliferates. There are those whose existences attest such an arrangement is possible after all. Given the effects they suffer, the leeches attached to their heads are likely used as a medical treatment meant to suck the blight from their bodies. And lastly, Limgrave may be a long distance from the roots of the Erdtree, but considering the uncontrollable spread of Deathroot once a Prince of Death has been grafted to its root system, it's reasonable to assume a purposeful and more focused application of it would, in fact, benefit from having this prince as far away from the Erdtree as he could possibly be. So knowing now who created the Death Prince and how, and also that its effects can be observed in Farum Azula, we can finally ascertain the purpose of its creation, which I believe to have been twofold. The ancient dragons who served the Gloam-Eyed Queen were a force to be reckoned with, and it is noticeably easier to defend your stronghold against them than it would have been to breach the defenses on theirs. Also, the dragons didn't all suddenly die after Melena's defeat. Killing the head of state doesn't immediately stop the war. There are still ancient dragons in Far Mazula to this very day. Even after their god was fled, Placido Sax continued to await its return, after all. But there's an interesting detail in Far Mazula connecting it to everything that's just been discussed. The trees and plants of certain areas are undergoing petrification, particularly around the worm faces and buildings containing deathroot. And the dragons themselves seem to be undergoing the same process. Their scales are naturally associated with mineral structures, of course, but the dead dragon found next to a crucible knight shows a much more advanced state of mineralization than they are usually associated with. It could also be argued that the fact gravel stone can be found on the ground and that some dragons even drop them upon death indicates they are losing the scales believed to be the source of their immortality. This argument is reinforced by the ashes some of them seem to be giving off, e.g. Grand Sax and Laendel, the aforementioned dead body next to a crucible knight, and the half-dead ancient dragon right after the Dragon Temple rooftop site of grace. The implication is that Deathroot was figuratively, perhaps even literally, planted at the heart of Farum Azula, and that Deathblight was used as a biological weapon against the ancient dragons. Incidentally, this can also be used to explain Placido Sax's grace affliction, given the golden hues of the Prince of Death's flames. And the final reason behind the ritual of Limgrave comes from the counterpart to the Prince of Death that it had created. In our time, Godwyn's soul died and his body became one such prince, while Rani's body died, seemingly burned, and her soul lived on. The birth of Stormveil's nameless prince demands another sacrifice be placed on the other end of the scale. Marika performed this ritual so that Melena's body could be killed, leaving her burned and bodiless, with nothing but her soul. A state in which Marika could more easily control her, having been a spirit caller herself. The diminished form of the Glomide Queen bears a very distinctive mark above her left eye, which she keeps closed for most of the time. But after the Lord of Frenzied Flame has risen, once Marika is gone, the mark is faded, her shackle is undone. For the first time in a very long time, her eyes are finally open, and I heard then such words from her, so ominous in nature as I never had thought possible. From this once tame and gentle maiden, the reckoning that she promises, the fate that she wields, and the return of the Glomide Queen. The Queen is dead. Long live the Queen. Again and again, unto eternity, until either only freedom or only ash remains, forevermore. And we have a bit more marginalia here, once again in the other hand than the scrawlings. Head spinning a little here. Strident sisters pull Schwester Krieg. Up-jumped flame priestesses see God and stars turfed from heaven as weapons. Everything has a twin. The doll and the corpse are siblings even more now than before. The missing counterbalance to the old eyeless thing. I like Torrent better. He's not so complicated, I hope. Your narrator has been a lie remains a lie, or Stray, as he is sometimes known.
Thank you all very much for watching, as always. This video was significantly longer than the previous ones in the series, and I think things are starting to come together quite nicely, and I hope you can all come with me on this journey to the end, because this game deserves it. It's not my favorite Soulsborne game, but the lore is quite good, actually. Thank you, a very special thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. I usually read out the names. I'm going to do something a little bit different now. I am not in a very good place in my life right now. my depression seems to be affecting my ability to function properly. There's a lot of bad shit happening, but lore hunting is my therapy, and my Patreon income isn't a whole lot, but it's enough to give me food and cigarettes for a few more days, and I am very thankful for that. For your support regarding both this ongoing project of mine that's been going on for a few years now. It's nice to know that this effort isn't going out into the void, that it resonates with people out there. And again, it helps to keep me fed, so thank you. Sorry if that was a bit too real. If you wanna help support this channel, feel free to check out my Patreon, or conversely, you can share my content on social media. It's good practice for the creators to do that, but I don't. So if you can do that for me, that would be nice. Because God knows I won't. Going back to the lore, we're finally getting into some of the more in-depth stuff, and some of the more layered stuff as well, which has always been present in Soulsborne lore, but I kinda feel like it's benefiting from that George R.R. Martin participation in the project as well, and that aspect, it's only going to get better from here on out, in my opinion. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I know there are some things in this video that may be a little bit controversial, but I quite like it. I know I'm biased, but I think it's a very interesting take that does justice to the source material. If you have any thoughts or questions, let me know in the comments. I've been busy with a lot of stuff, including but not limited to trying to get these videos out there. Sorry that I missed my previously established deadline of about 2 weeks per video on this one, but I do respond to comments. I try to respond to all of them, even if it takes a while. And yeah, guess that's that for now. Stay safe and see you around.